Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrew Regal, Technical Lead for the Alchemist Training Team, and I'm joined by Helen Tucker, e-learning tutor and consultant. Today we'll be talking about risk assessment, specifically from the perspective of the SME. So if you have any questions, please use the question panel. By way of introduction, any task will be performed more efficiently and effectively if some forethought is given to where it is to be performed, how it will be implemented, and what the expected outcome will be. Risk assessment is an essential part of that planning process. Most work carries a risk of potential harm and injury, and therefore employers must consider what should be actively done to control it. It is not possible to control all risks completely. Work would not be possible under these conditions. However, the risk of injury and damage should be controlled to reasonable and acceptable levels, and it is the aim of risk assessment to achieve this. We'll discuss these principles throughout the webinar. So the topics to be discussed today include the objectives of risk assessment, legal requirements and competency, simple risk assessment procedure, evaluating risks and recommending control measures, documenting and communicating risk assessments, and reviewing risk assessments. So looking at the objectives of the risk assessment. So these are to identify significant hazards in the workplace, decide on priorities based on the level of risk involved, and to set objectives for eliminating hazards and reducing risks in order to prevent workplace accidents. So it's crucially important to appreciate that risk assessment is not an end in itself, but it's rather a means of managing risk. Many organizations fail to appreciate this and will invest far too much time in developing paperwork without actually making use of the process to benefit their business. The assessment must be reviewed if there are any reasons to suspect that the assessment is no longer valid, or there are changes in the work that it relates to. So this will be discussed in greater detail by Helen later. So although there is a legal requirement to write down a risk assessment if there are 5 or more employees, it is advisable in many circumstances to record risk assessments anyway. And the benefits from doing this are that it demonstrates legal compliance, it proves that the assessment was carried out, it shows that you are able to show the assessment to prospective clients, it helps when joining contractor assessment schemes, it enables the assessment to be more easily reviewed in the future, and to check that everything is being considered. So what is it that the law actually requires? So the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 places a duty on employers to ensure the health and safety of employees and those affected by the work activities, as given in sections 2 and 3. However, the explicit requirement concerning risk assessment is in Regulation 3 of the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999, which requires employers to undertake a suitable and sufficient assessment of A, the risks to the health and safety of their employees to which they are exposed whilst they are at work, and B, the risks to the health and safety of persons not in their employment arising out of or in connection with the conduct by them of their undertaking, for purposes of identifying the measures they need to take to comply with the requirements and prohibitions imposed upon them by or under relevant statutory provisions. So at this stage, we need to quickly explain that for a risk assessment to be considered suitable and sufficient for purposes of these regulations, it will need to ensure that all aspects of work activity are reviewed, take account of the way in which the work is organised, identify the significant hazards and risks, evaluate the risks, identify control measures, enable priorities to be set, ensure that non-routine operations are taken into account, take account of risks to the public, ensure that staff who undertake the assessment have sufficient competence, knowledge and experience, and ensure that the risk assessment is valid for a reasonable time. So as we've mentioned, Regulation 3, Part 6 states that where the employer employs 5 or more employees, they shall record A, the significant findings of the assessment, and B, any group of their employees identified by it as being especially at risk. For the reasons already mentioned, it would be regarded as good practice to record the findings of a risk assessment, even if less than 5 people are employed. It is important to remember that for smaller, lower risk organisations, this should not be an onerous task and is likely to be fairly straightforward to complete. However, also remember that risk assessments are often the first piece of evidence sought by regulators in the event of an accident investigation or prosecution being brought. So it is recommended that risk assessment should be viewed as a team effort with the following personnel and skills as a minimum. So someone with a knowledge of risk assessment techniques, someone with a knowledge of the process to be assessed, the ability to interpret standards, attention to detail, good recording and communication techniques, and someone with managerial influence to authorize and implement change. So the risk assessors themselves will need to be competent in the following areas to carry out an effective risk assessment. So experience and training in hazard identification and carrying out risk assessments, knowledge of the process or activity, technical knowledge of the plant or equipment, good communication and report writing skills, ability to interpret legislation and guidance, and possess the right attitude to carry out the risk assessment. So those seeking further guidance on the topic of competence might like to view our previous webinar entitled Health and Safety Competent Persons, What SMEs Need to Know. So now we move on to the simple risk assessment procedure. So before we go into the process of risk assessment itself, it's important that we make clear some of the terminology that's involved here. Hazard is defined as something with a potential to cause harm. This can include articles, substances, plant or machines, methods of work, the working environment, and other aspects of work organization. So those hazards can be categorized as physical, such as trailing cables or electricity, chemical, such as cleaning chemicals or fuels, biological, such as bacteria or viruses, ergonomic, for example, repetitive movements or strenuous activities, or psychological, such as work pressures or hours of working. And then we have risk, which is defined as the combination of the likelihood of occurrence of a work-related hazardous event or exposure and the severity of injury and ill health that can be caused by the event or exposure. So risk assessment is a logical process of collecting information and making judgments against standards often set out in law. There are no fixed rules about how a risk assessment should be carried out. In practice, it will depend on the nature of the work or business and the types of hazards and risks. However, the requirements of the management of health and safety at work regulations must be fulfilled. In addition, the risk assessment process should be practical and take account of the views of employees and their safety representatives who will be able to contribute practical knowledge. In the HSE guidance document, Risk Assessment, a brief guide to controlling risks in the workplace, reference INDG 163, which is available free of charge on the HSE website. The process of risk assessment is broken down into 5 common sense steps. Step 1 is look for and identify the hazards. 2, decide who might be harmed and in what circumstances. 3, evaluate the risks arising from the hazards and decide whether the existing precautions are adequate or if more should be done. 4, record the significant findings. And 5, review the assessment if there is a significant change or evidence that the original assessment was inadequate. So the first step is to identify the potential sources and form of harm. Sources of information to do this include task observation and inspection. So an observation of the task or working environment can allow the assessor to identify physical hazards which are not well controlled and operator working practices. The observation criteria can be implemented via a checklist to ensure consistency, but the overall identification of hazards for the assessment does not need to rely solely on observation. Incident and ill health data. So reactive monitoring systems record data from accidents, ill health absences, and other incidents. Data can be analysed and judgments made about the cause of such incidents, and this information can then be used to identify hazards. Job safety analysis. Job safety or task analysis is a work study technique which carefully observes and records every detail of a task. The method of working is then evaluated to identify hazards and develop an ideal safe method of working. Job safety analysis is the basis of task-based risk assessments. And legislation. Legal standards provide information on hazards and controls that must be considered within general risk assessment. For example, manual handling operations regulations. Guidance from the HSE, BSI, manufacturers, for instance. General guidance provided by the HSE in supporting regulations is a useful source of information when considering the presence of hazards. For example, guidance to the manual handling operations regulations. Designers and manufacturers and suppliers also have a duty to provide safety information on articles and substances which are produced for use at work. This information must identify hazards associated with substances, for example, material safety data sheets, product labels, etc., and equipment. And consultation. Operators of equipment and those that carry out the tasks become experts and will be able to give valuable detail about what can go wrong, such as any accidents or near misses, etc. They may also be able to give practical suggestions about control measures. It's therefore good practice to use the knowledge and experience of managers and operators when identifying hazards in the workplace. Risk assessments are often task-based. However, it may be necessary to look at specific hazard assessments, such as machinery, transport, electrical, etc., or to divide the worksite into geographical areas. When identifying hazards, you're only required to identify those which would be considered to be significant, so don't get too bogged down with trivialities. Next, it's important to identify who might be at risk and how this might occur. And this includes employees, for example, operators, maintenance staff, cleaners, persons working in close proximity or passing through the area, and non-employees, such as agency workers, contractors, visitors, and members of the public. Some people may be particularly at risk, for example, young or inexperienced workers, new and expectant mothers, night workers, home workers, lone workers, or disabled staff, for instance. At this point, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Helen Tucker, who will discuss the remaining stages of the risk assessment process.
The next step in the process is to evaluate the risk. So just as we referred to, the likelihood that that harm is going to happen to the staff that's undertaking the work and the probable severity. So what's the level of injury that could occur? Is it a fatality? Could it be a fracture or minor injuries, cuts and bruises? So we can determine what's going to be the most significant risks. What are our priorities? What do we need to focus on the most? So to do this, we have to look at what we already have in place. Is it adequate and effective? Is it useful? Does it do its job? So we look at the existing control measures that we've already implemented and we ask ourselves those questions. So for example, this may be that we only provide PPE in the form of gloves when using chemicals in a hairdresser's, and we haven't considered any other potential controls. We then look at estimating that risk, which in practical terms usually means that we apply a numerical figure using the judgment that we have from our knowledge and experience. But I'm going to explain this in a little bit more detail later. And then we have to ask ourselves, do we need to do more? Is there any further action that we need to take that could either eliminate or reduce it? Could we put something better in place? a greater measure that's actually going to take that numerical figure that we've applied and make it lower. So therefore, we're reducing the level of harm to a more appropriate or even safer level that we had previously. So it's important that we take our existing control measures as the starting point to our risk assessment, because for once, it actually gives us a record for all the control measures that we already have in place and what's currently being used. But let's make sure we understand what we mean by control measures. So ideally, we always want to be able to try to eliminate the hazard as best we possibly can. And at that point, we usually take it at the form of the hazard itself. So we talk about those as sort of technical controls, either changing the process or the way we work or the actual substance itself, and seeing if that we can actually remove it. So a good example, and we all are aware of this one when we think about window cleaners and how we've removed the hazards from working at height by using telescopic poles from the ground. But we have to put it into perspective that eliminations of hazards is not always practical. We live in the real world where hazards are always all around us. So we then look at whether we can reduce it to a safer or a lower level. So we think about warehouse working. We've got forklift trucks or workplace transport, and we've got people. It's not practical to eliminate either. So we need to look at segregation of walkways and traffic routes. How do we do that? Well, we can look at providing fixed barriers or painted walkways. So it's sort of starting and leading you into some practical control measures that we can start identifying. And as you'll see, a lot of it is about that common sense approach. What can we actually do that's realistic and practical in our workplace terms? And then we can look at procedural controls that we can put in place. So if we take on this occasion an example of noise, job rotation can actually help reduce the frequency, so how often they are exposed to the noise hazard, or the duration, how long they are, in order to reduce that person's exposure. So the likelihood of that exposure is reduced, and potentially the likelihood of the severity of harm may be reduced in reducing the potential for hearing loss. Safe systems of work can be used, so having written work methods, which can include use of shock absorbers on noisy equipment, how well maintained that equipment needs to be, the use of sound barriers, etc. And lastly, we look at control measures that influence behaviour of workers, because this is an important factor. We can put all the physical control measures that we possibly can, but then we are influenced by behaviour, and people can choose whether they use it or not. So we've got to consider whether we need any further clear information, instructions, training in the use of the equipment, as well as the control measures. Do they understand why it's important they are used, when to use them, and ensure that's supervised, so that managers, team leaders, supervisors are actually ensuring that the rules and risk assessments that we've put in place are actually being followed. And then we look at monitoring techniques, which is an important control measure that simply or sometimes gets overlooked. We want to make sure we do what we say we're going to do. If our risk assessment states that we are going to segregate our workers from workplace transport, have we actually done that? Is it effective? Does it work in real terms? Goes back to looking at all that documentation that Andrew discussed earlier. Have we seen a reduction in accidents, for example? So good assessments also recognise the importance of how staff behave. Do they use the equipment? For example, is there a machine that there is a guard on? So we think about a disc cutter in the construction industry. Is it regularly removed? Why are they removing it? Is it ineffective due to poor visibility? Therefore, we can look at during the evaluation process, do we need an alternative? Do we need to change that equipment for something more effective? Could they use the equipment for the wrong purpose? Therefore, our instructions need to be clear in our do's and don'ts. What's the equipment suitable for? What's it been designed for? To make sure that, in essence, we can help influence that behaviour and ensure the risk assessment becomes a live document, that they are actually putting in place what we want them to and using what we want. As we touched on earlier, it's about estimating that level of risk, applying our judgment using knowledge and past experience. And as Andrew said, there is no right or wrong way in order to conduct the assessment, and certainly the risk rating, it can be used in different ways. Some companies choose to look at the assessment of risk before any control measures have been put in place. So the raw hazard, what's the level of risk with nothing in place? Whereas others may decide to evaluate it with what's currently in place, deciding what we can do more, and then evaluating it again to determine the residual risk, so the risk that's left over. Because we have to accept that we're never going to live in an environment where we've removed or we have zero harm. We have to look at it in a practical, common sense approach. But the benefits help us be able to identify what our priorities are. What do we need to do first? What are the key hazards that staff need to be aware of? So it allows us to look at whether what we've done is enough. Is it acceptable? So as you can see from the slide, in its most simple form, it's very numerical. High major injuries that potentially could cause death, we're looking at a 3. Low minor injuries, first aid grazes, we're looking at a 1. The likelihood of harm, if it's really likely that the event's going to happen, perhaps you know it's happened before, will be a 3. Alternatively, if it's fairly likely to happen, hasn't happened on many occasions, but it could, you might apply a 2. And what that allows us to lead into is to be able to identify those priorities. So you can see here, it's a very simple matrix of being able to identify that figure, and usually you will multiply them together. 1 times 1, the likelihood of harm times the severity gives you an overall figure numerically of a 1. 2 times 2 is 4. So as you can see, very straightforward. Now what we bring into that is what action we then need to take. If your risk ratings are around that red level, 6 or 9, means we're at a high risk. We may need to consider further resources, specialised equipment or high levels of supervision to try to bring that to a level. We know it's a serious priority, we've got to do something about it. Whereas if we're in the lower risk area, we may find that it's at an acceptable level. We can tolerate it as it is. We can't do any more. We may just want to monitor it to ensure it stays the same. But what we want to try to influence is remember that that rating isn't set down in legislation. You don't need to use a numerical number. If you feel a more simple scale of high, medium or low is more appropriate for you and your staff. The important bit is that it's the evaluation. Do you understand how it's applied, what's important, what's a priority? It's no good if your assessment has numerical figures that your staff do not understand, that they read it, have no idea how that's applied or what it means to them. It then becomes a worthless exercise. So again, it's about making it real and a live document for you and your staff. So then when we've evaluated the risk, we've got to make sure it's recorded. We've got to record those findings. So it's going to include the person carrying out the risk assessment. So it goes back down to what Andrew was talking about earlier, in the competency and the person's accountability for doing the assessment, the date and time it was conceived, the details of location, activities or equipment and people being assessed. It's important to make sure that we're looking at marginalised people that we need to take into account. We're looking at the disabled persons, we're looking at the pregnant workers and whether those assessments or controls are any different. Remember, it's about significant hazards. We want to avoid the trivial. We want to make sure it's the real hazards associated with the work activity and the job that's been undertaken. We're looking at the extent of the risk, additional control measures required. So everything that we've discussed throughout that process, you can see those steps are the steps that we record going forward. And our date for review. Now that review date may be at different periods, and we're going to be discussing that shortly. And other documents are also sometimes referenced in the assessment. Organisations may decide to reference policies and procedures or HSE guidance documents that we use, trade publications. What its purpose for is to direct staff to other useful documents where you feel that might be useful or helpful. It's not mandatory. It's about making sure that it's as useful as it possibly can be, and to direct staff to further documents where necessary. So here on the screen is a very simple record of ensuring that the risk assessment's recorded. You can change it or amend it as you see fit. And as you can see, this particular version allows that risk rating when existing control measures are in place and once new additional measures have been taken. It is important, and you can see what is a hazard and how people can be harmed, that you're as clear as you possibly can be so staff can understand how that applies to them. So for example, think about working at height. The hazard of a missing guardrail on a scaffold. How can it cause harm? Well, potentially because of a fall, because the guardrail is missing, again, depending on the height in which you're at, a fatality or serious injury such as fractures and cuts can be experienced. So you can really see it's a very straightforward, clear process. You don't need to overcomplicate it. It's keeping it as simple as possible at the level your staff understand. And as you can see, whether that's been a task-based assessment or generic in nature where you're perhaps lone working or you're moving from place to place. The importance of the risk assessment in a vital chain of the risk assessment process is to ensure that the staff have been involved in this process, that trade unions and safety representatives have been consulted. Once you've got to this stage and you may have recorded your findings, you've discussed it with staff, go back and share it with them. Use team meetings, one-to-ones, speak to trade union reps, ask them to get their opinion. Is there anything that's been missed? They are the ones on the ground doing the job. They have such a valuable insight into the risk assessment process and where the hazards and control measures are really going to work. Because if you get their buy-in, you get them part of the process, they're going to follow for what you want them to do. And inevitably, you're going to provide a safer and a more healthier workplace. Because as Andrew touched upon, it is a legal requirement to have the documentation in place, but we don't want to play lip service to it. We want to make sure it works. We want it to be a live, active document that everyone feels part of. That's what leads us into our action plan. With our further controls, we know what we need to do next. So it clearly shows what our priorities are. Remember, we can't do everything first. Some things will have to be chosen as more significant and a serious immediate priority, and others may come later during the time period, within the month, within the week, depending on what's needed. You need to clearly show those priorities, what needs to be taken and who's going to undertake that. And that sometimes in smaller organisations is going to be the same person, may even be the owner of the business, and that's fine. But it's important that somebody does take responsibility for those actions. looks at the resources available, what's reasonable, what can be achieved, and when can it be achieved by. There is no point in having an action plan and a risk assessment if you don't take the action that's recommended or that's needed. And the last step of the chain is the review process. So we want to make sure that we keep up to date, that our risk assessment remains valid, that it remains current, up to date. So how we do that is that you will touch upon it when following an accident, ill health, or near miss. So if a staff comes to you and says they've had an accident, or actually that they potentially slipped on a wet floor but didn't injure themselves, you might want to go and review, did something go wrong? What control measures weren't being used? Links back into how you find out what those control measures and how effective they are. When new equipment has been introduced, after changes in personnel and changes of legislation. You can see here from the slide, there's quite a significant list of when you would look at and go and revisit your assessments. Your insurance company may ask you at a set interval to go back and ensure they're up to date, or from an enforcing authority visit, not necessarily from a criminal investigation taking a prosecution. They may come to visit and give some informal advice and tell you that actually their assessment could be improved, which is really invaluable and is going to help you as a business. And also, you will know when technology advances, as new equipment comes on the market, use your technical expertise, how you keep up to date. If you know something new is on the market and could be quite useful, go back, revisit your assessment, can you implement it? As we said, if you employ young persons, expectant mothers, or disabled workers, you're just going to make sure you tailor your assessment to ensure you've included them. Go back, make sure that if the control measures relate specifically to them, do you need to do something different for those special categories of workers? And then we know after a specific period of time. So periodically, we know that we're going to revisit them. And good practice will tell you that usually is on an annual basis, that you know you can periodically book that in, you'll know when it's due. And remember, from a practical perspective, we all know that it's quite easy to change the date, to not really give it as much thought that we need it to. It's not going to take long to just go back through the processes, go back to talking staff to ensure we do a thorough review, to make sure that we're doing the best that we possibly can. Because time spent now will be well spent in the future, and will certainly protect yourselves from that potential prosecution or compensation claim. There's lots of sources of information that you can seek to help you supplement your risk assessment. The Health and Safety Executive's website has lots of templates available that you can use, that you may even be able to recreate and tailor specifically to your individual needs. There's the Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, which also have toolkits available, as well as training courses such as NEBOSH as well, for the National Examination Board for Safety and Health. So they also look at risk assessment, and their training courses have significant sections on how to do risk assessment in more detail. But again, as I said, it's about utilising the resources that you've got available to you and supplement your own knowledge and experience. The Federation of Small Businesses have lots of useful information and fact sheets that you can tailor and utilise. And then Alchemist website has all details of our training courses available, as well as the services we provide. If you require any more information on how to manage risk assessment in your own business, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We'd be happy to help. Our contact details are on the screen now. Alchemist PSM specialises in health and safety and HR consultancies for SME market, and are there right at the end of the phone to offer further advice and guidance in all your health and safety matters. But should you want to develop your own knowledge and your expertise in some of these fields and areas, then our Alchemist Training Academy is an accredited provider for NEBOSH, IOSH courses, as well as the Institute of Environmental management and assessment courses. So if you're looking at branching into the environmental sector or environmental assessment. That concludes our main presentation section of the webinar. So we're now going to be going into our question and answer section. So we look forward to hearing your questions.
Okay, so the first question that we've received is the work I do changes a lot, moving from site to site. So how should I manage this? So as you will probably have gathered from the information that Helen and myself have discussed, one size doesn't fit all necessarily with risk assessment. So it's a case of making sure that the risk assessment that you do is applicable to the work that is going to be done. So the extent that you need to review and redo a risk assessment will depend on how different the risks are. So a generic risk assessment is all well and good, but it's a case of making sure that that is tailored where necessary to include additional risks. So if you are visiting a client's site, it is important to obtain information from that client from their own risk assessments so that you can incorporate that into your risk assessment.
And we've had a really good question about what responsibility do my employees have when it comes to risk assessment. Now that's really key, because it's all well and good that we've talked about today's webinar about, yes, it's very much about the SME's responsibility for risk assessment, what the employer has to do. But it's like I said earlier, it is a live document and is only as good as the whole process and it's how it's been implemented. The employees have a responsibility to follow what you set down within that assessment. Again, it's why I've said it's important for them to form part of the process. They've got their legal obligation to protect themselves, follow the assessment and use the control measures that you've identified that are needed. So it is important that they fully understand the implications of the assessment, that they read it. Are you giving them time enough to read and understand it? How do you make sure that they are understanding that? So again, it's about revisiting that within your one-to-ones in your meetings, speaking to staff and revisiting that they completely understand what they have read and making sure they've got sufficient time. Answer their questions. If they're not sure why things are being set down the way they have been, then make sure that you're answering those questions so that they're really clear. And some organisations even have a record of when those risk assessments have been given to staff, either through their induction process. There's usually a signature sheet which is signed and dated to use as supplementary evidence, just in case from, as I said, from enforcement, from a civil litigation point of view. We all know that we don't always record when we pass information to our staff. So it's really vital that you get some cover for yourself. And that's what we want to make sure, that you're legally compliant and you've got some good evidence.
Okay, we've got one more question. This one concerns a pregnant worker. So we have a pregnant worker in our workplace. What do I need to do to consider in a risk assessment? So what we would say initially is that even before you have this issue arise, employers should have risk assessments in place if they are employing any woman who is of childbearing age, so that if the employer is then told that they are pregnant, you've got a policy and a procedure in place already which you can then enact should that situation arise. So in that situation, your risk assessment will obviously need to consider the additional risks that they will be exposed to because of their condition. So for instance, if they're working in an office, you need to look at whether they're going to be sat down for prolonged periods, and if they then need to be able to take breaks and to stand up and walk around. You need to perhaps review their workstation assessment so that if their chair needs adjusting, or a new chair, for instance, to take account of their needs. And also to take account of how their needs might change across the pregnancy, so that you know, as that changes, you can incorporate that into the risk assessment and any further additional control measures that will be necessary. So just to conclude today's webinar, there is a quick survey at the end of this, and we'd be really grateful if you could complete that. So thank you all for listening. We hope that this has been of use for you.